You never expect a monster to grow up in a quiet Midwestern suburb. But behind the white siding and mowed lawns of Bath, Ohio, one boy was quietly unraveling. Animals began disappearing. A young boy wandered the woods collecting bones. And nobody, not the neighbors, not the teachers, not even his own parents, saw what he was becoming. Before we dive into the main story, if stories like this deserve to be told, take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe for more true crime cases like this. And don't forget to tap the notification bell, because every detail matters when you're piecing together the mind of a killer. Before he became one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, Jeffrey Dahmer was a boy like any other. He was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a chemist, his mother a homemaker, and from the outside, the family looked perfectly ordinary. But inside that house, tension simmered. Joyce struggled with mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, and often took prescription medications. Lionel, often absorbed in his work and studies, was frequently absent, physically and emotionally. By the age of 6, Jeffrey had already undergone a surgery for a double hernia, an event some psychologists believe contributed to his later issues. Shortly after, the family moved to Bath, Ohio, a quiet, wooded suburb outside Akron. It was there, surrounded by nature, that his fascination with death began. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, polite, a little odd, but nothing alarming. He collected roadkill. He'd walk into the woods with a bag and return with bones, fascinated by the inner workings of animals. He called them his experiments. He once preserved a dog's head and placed it on a stake. He dissected small animals, often dissolving tissue using chemicals Lionel had shown him during a father-son bonding moment. It had started as scientific curiosity, but for Jeffrey it became something else. At home, the situation deteriorated. Joyce's mental health declined further, and the marriage began to collapse. Arguments were frequent and loud. By the time Jeffrey reached high school, he was increasingly isolated. He began drinking heavily, even hiding alcohol in the school bathroom and sipping it between classes. Teachers noticed, but few intervened. He developed a reputation among classmates for bizarre pranks. Fake seizures, strange noises, but no one took them seriously. They thought he was just the class clown. But behind the laughter, a storm was brewing. By age 14 or 15, Jeffrey had begun having violent sexual fantasies, often involving domination and control. He later admitted that around this time, he began fantasizing about corpses. His first known thoughts of murder began around the age of 16. But no one knew. Not his teachers. Not his parents. Not even the friends who laughed at his jokes. By 1978, the same year he would graduate from Revere High School, everything would shift. His parents' marriage imploded. Joyce left the home, taking his younger brother, David, with her. Lionel moved out too. At just 18, Jeffrey was left alone in the family home, with no supervision, no guidance, and no one to stop what would come next. That summer, he would pick up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. It was supposed to be just a ride, turned into Dahmer's first murder. But before that turning point, there's a chilling question. How did no one see this coming? How does a quiet, curious child become a predator? And did anyone, in those early years, ever get close enough to stop him? The warning signs were there, the fascination with bones, the alcohol abuse, the emotional instability, but they went ignored, overshadowed by suburban normalcy, missed by a society that didn't want to see what was hiding in plain sight. And the boy in Bath, Ohio? He was no longer just curious. He was preparing. Do you think Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes could have been prevented if someone had intervened during his childhood? Or was the darkness already too deep by then? By the time Jeffrey Dahmer entered his teenage years, something had shifted. The curious boy who once dissected animals in the woods behind his Ohio home was changing, and no one around him could quite see how dark things were becoming. At Revere High School in Bath Township, Dahmer stood out, but not for the reasons most would imagine. Teachers and classmates remembered him as quiet, polite, even shy, a boy who rarely caused trouble. But those who knew him closer saw another side. Detached, distant, and often lost in thought. He had begun drinking heavily by the age of 14. Some classmates said they could smell liquor on his breath during morning classes. Others recalled him sneaking vodka or scotch in a hollowed-out cup or hiding it in his locker. When confronted, Dahmer would shrug it off, calling it his medicine. Alcohol became his escape, a way to drown out the noise of his parents' endless fighting and the growing chaos at home. Joyce's mental health had deteriorated further, and she was taking multiple prescription drugs for anxiety and depression. His father, Lionel, was consumed by his work and often away for long stretches. What was left behind was a home filled with tension, arguments, and emotional distance. Dahmer learned early to suppress his emotions, to hide his pain behind a calm, blank stare. But beneath that quiet surface, his thoughts were spiraling. Around the age of 15, Jeffrey began experiencing intrusive fantasies, violent and sexual in nature. He later admitted to investigators that he would imagine controlling a male partner completely, to the point where they could not leave. These fantasies were not fleeting thoughts. They were obsessive. He began to imagine not just intimacy, but power, the idea of having someone entirely under his control, body and soul. Around the same time, his fascination with death evolved into something far more disturbing. While other boys were occupied with sports or dates, Dahmer spent his afternoons examining animal bones, bleaching skulls, and fantasizing about what it would feel like to have a human body completely dependent on him. He later said that his fantasies weren't initially about killing, but about keeping someone forever. Yet, the connection between control and death was beginning to take shape. Teachers at Revere High noticed he was slipping academically. His grades plummeted, and his participation in class vanished. Once a curious student, Dahmer had become withdrawn, often sitting in silence, but outwardly he still managed to blend in. He even developed a reputation as a prankster, someone who would imitate people with disabilities or fake seizures to make classmates laugh. They called these moments doing a Dahmer. To his peers, it was odd humor. To Dahmer, it was a way to mask his detachment, to pretend to be part of something normal. By 1977, his parents' marriage was collapsing completely. Joyce's emotional breakdowns became more severe, and arguments between her and Lionel escalated. Their divorce was finalized the following summer, in July 1978, when Jeffrey was 18. His younger brother, David, went to live with their mother, while Lionel moved out to a nearby motel, leaving Jeffrey alone in the house. In those lonely months after graduation, Dahmer's isolation was complete. He had no close friends, no job, no college plans. He spent his days drinking and his nights driving aimlessly around Bath Township. It was during this time, alone in the house surrounded by bottles and bones, that his fantasies turned physical. He later said, "The house was mine. I had no one to answer to, and that's when it started." The summer heat was oppressive in June 1978 when Jeffrey Dahmer met his first victim, Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker heading to a rock concert in Cleveland. Hicks accepted Dahmer's offer for a ride, and Jeffrey brought him back to the empty house. They listened to music, drank beer, and talked for hours. But when Hicks decided it was time to leave, something in Jeffrey snapped. He didn't want him to go. He couldn't stand the thought of being alone again. In a moment of panic and obsession, he picked up a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Hicks from behind, killing him instantly. It was the first time Jeffrey acted on the dark fantasies that had been growing for years, and he didn't stop there. He stripped the body, masturbated over it, and later dismembered it in the basement. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered the remains in the woods behind the house. Dahmer would later tell investigators that as soon as he killed Hicks, he knew he had crossed a line he could never return from. But he also said something chilling, that it brought him a sense of peace. The act had given him what he had always fantasized about, complete control. After the murder, Dahmer tried to return to normal life. He attended Ohio State University briefly that fall but dropped out after just one term due to failing grades and excessive drinking. His father, desperate to help, enlisted him in the U.S. Army in 1979. Dahmer served as a combat medic in Germany but continued drinking heavily. He was eventually discharged in March 1981 for unsuitability. But before the first murder, before the army, before the spiral of violence, the seeds were already there. Loneliness, alcoholism, suppressed sexuality, and a fascination with death. The boy who once roamed the woods behind his Bath home collecting animal bones had now crossed the line between fascination and destruction. He was only 18. The people who once passed him in the school hallway, who laughed at his jokes or ignored his silence, would never have imagined what that quiet boy from Bath would become. But Jeffrey Dahmer's transformation from an awkward teenager into a killer wasn't sudden. It was years in the making, a slow descent that no one stopped. The fractured mind had finally split, and the monster had begun to emerge. He offered him a ride, invited him home for a few beers, and the boy who accepted never walked out again. June 18, 1978. The sky over Bath Township, Ohio, was calm, the kind of evening that meant nothing, until it did. Jeffrey Dahmer had just graduated from Revere High School 3 weeks earlier. He was 18, aimless, and alone. His parents' marriage had disintegrated in a mess of screaming matches and court filings. Both had left the family home, leaving Jeff for the first time in full control of an empty house. And that's where he saw him, Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, hitchhiking home after a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Long brown hair, guitar slung over his shoulder, and no idea what the next hour would hold. Dahmer slowed his car, rolled down the window, and asked if he needed a ride. Stephen said yes. Later, Dahmer would tell police it was the first time he didn't want someone to leave, that he felt something stirring, a desire to possess, to keep. So he invited Stephen to his house for a few beers, and Stephen agreed. They drank, talked, listened to music. At some point, Stephen said he needed to get going. Jeffrey panicked. He didn't want to be alone again, didn't want this moment to end. He grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Stephen from behind. One hit, then another. Then he strangled him. And when it was done, the reality of what he'd done settled in like a fog. Jeffrey Dahmer had just killed someone, but what happened next set the tone for every murder that would follow. He stripped Stephen's body, masturbated over it, then dragged the corpse to the crawlspace under the house. Over the next several days, he dissected it, removed flesh, dissolved parts in acid, and crushed the bones with a sledgehammer. He flushed much of it down the toilet. Some of it he scattered in the woods behind the house. And no one suspected a thing. The house stayed quiet. His parents never came back. Stephen Hicks was listed as a missing person. It would be over a decade before police connected Jeffrey Dahmer to Stephen's death. Before they found bone fragments buried in the backyard. Before Dahmer calmly told detectives every detail like he was recounting a grocery list. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a one-time explosion. It was ritual. Years later, in court, he said he had no intention of killing Stephen, that he just didn't want him to leave. But he did. Stephen Hicks left the world the moment he stepped into that car. And Jeffrey Dahmer became something else entirely. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After the brutal killing of Stephen Hicks in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer somehow managed to slip back into the rhythm of everyday life. His father, Lionel Dahmer, unaware of what had occurred under their roof, encouraged Jeffrey to enroll in Ohio State University. Perhaps college would provide structure. Perhaps it would help him find direction, a sense of belonging. But the monster within Jeffrey was not gone. It was merely silent for now. At Ohio State, Dahmer enrolled in business classes. On paper, he was just another freshman. But in reality, he was unraveling. He barely attended lectures, rarely studied, and spent most of his time isolated in his dorm room, drinking. The weight of the murder haunted him. He later admitted to waking up in cold sweats, reliving the moment he bludgeoned Stephen Hicks. By the end of his first semester, his grades were abysmal. His GPA hovered at 0.45. Lionel pulled him out and gave him an ultimatum: straighten up or get out. With few options, Jeffrey agreed to enlist in the U.S. Army. In January 1979, he was sent to Fort McClellan in Alabama for basic training. He performed well enough to be assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment in Baumholder, West Germany, as a combat medic. At first, the discipline of military life seemed to suit him. Structured routines kept his mind occupied. He was far from Bath, Ohio, and even farther from the scene of his first murder. But the darkness was still there, just dormant. Soon, Dahmer's old demons returned. He began drinking heavily again, often in secret. His superiors noted the smell of alcohol on his breath. Fellow soldiers later came forward, saying that Dahmer's behavior was disturbing. 2 even accused him of drugging and sexually assaulting them during their time in Germany. He was discharged in March 1981, officially for unsuitability. It wasn't a dishonorable discharge, but it was clear the army wanted nothing more to do with him. They sent him home with a plane ticket and no plan. Instead of returning to Ohio, Dahmer chose to head to Miami Beach, Florida. The sunshine, he thought, might bring clarity. He worked at a sandwich shop, rented a room at a motel, and lived in near anonymity. But even in paradise, his past clung to him like a shadow. He drank himself into stupors, was evicted from his motel, and finally called his father in defeat. Lionel agreed to bring him back home to Ohio. But things had changed. Dahmer was now deeply reliant on alcohol. He stole, lied, and drifted from job to job. At one point, his father had enough. He sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, hoping that her gentle influence and Christian values might help. For a while, it seemed to work. In his grandmother's home, Dahmer was polite and helpful. He accompanied her to church, did chores, and even held a job as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. But behind closed doors, the spiral continued. He began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. He drank heavily, experimented with sedatives, and began fantasizing again about control, about unconscious bodies. The duality of Dahmer's life was becoming harder to hide. To his family, he was odd but functional. To those who met him at night, he was someone else entirely. Quiet, brooding, and increasingly dangerous. He was arrested in 1982 for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair Park. It seemed minor, but it marked the beginning of his long trail of encounters with law enforcement. Then, in 1986, he was arrested again, this time for masturbating in front of 2 boys. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, and the charge was reduced. He served just 1 year of probation, but the urges were back in full force. The murders would soon begin again, and this time he wouldn't stop. From the outside, Jeffrey Dahmer had attempted a comeback. He'd tried college. He'd worn the uniform of a U.S. soldier. He'd walked under the warm Florida sun and sat at his grandmother's dinner table. But the man behind the mask was unraveling. Each setting, school, military, home, was a facade he couldn't maintain. The beast inside had tasted blood, and it was hungry again. What would follow would leave the world stunned, horrified, and asking how no one had seen it coming. What do you think caused Dahmer's downward spiral, nature, nurture, or both? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you're drawn to stories like this, where the truth hides behind an ordinary smile, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, subscribe for more, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what we uncover next. The hallway always smelled off. Some said it was rotting meat. Others blamed the plumbing. But no one imagined what was really inside apartment 213. A place so ordinary, yet hiding something monstrous. And Jeffrey Dahmer? He walked in and out like nothing was wrong. In 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Unit 213 of the Oxford Apartments. Rent was $300 per month. The complex, located at 924 North 25th Street, was low-income housing with a plain exterior, the kind of place you'd pass without a second glance. For Dahmer, it was the ideal hunting ground. He had lived with his grandmother before, but she eventually kicked him out due to his strange habits. Foul smells, late nights, and an arrest for indecent exposure. He needed privacy, seclusion, a space no one would question, and apartment 213 gave him just that. Inside that apartment, behind a locked door and drawn curtains, Dahmer committed some of the most horrifying crimes in modern American history. Over the next 16 months, at least 12 men and boys would enter that apartment and never leave. The killings escalated in frequency and brutality. Neighbors reported odd sounds, power tools late at night, dragging noises, thuds. Others complained about a terrible stench that seemed to come and go. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, remembered Dahmer as quiet but polite. She lived in the same building and sometimes chatted with him in the hallway. Once he offered her a sandwich. She declined. Years later, she would wonder what kind of meat it contained. The murders followed a pattern. Dahmer lured victims with promises of money, alcohol, or modeling gigs. Once inside, he drugged their drinks, waited for them to pass out, and then strangled them. Afterward, he dismembered the bodies, often keeping bones, skulls, or organs as souvenirs. Inside the refrigerator, Dahmer kept heads and hearts. In the freezer, limbs and torsos. Acid-filled vats sat in his bedroom closet used to dissolve flesh. He experimented with preservation methods. He painted skulls, boiled bones, and attempted to construct a private altar made from human remains. But it didn't stop at murder. Dahmer wanted control not just physically, but psychologically. He tried to create zombies, drilling into the skulls of unconscious victims and injecting acid or boiling water directly into their brains. He hoped they would survive in a state of compliance. None did. One of the most devastating moments came in May 1991, when Dahmer targeted 14-year-old Konorak Synthesumphone, the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had previously assaulted. He brought Konorak to his apartment, drugged him, and began his gruesome experiment. Somehow, the boy managed to escape, naked, bruised, and disoriented, and was found by 3 women on the street. They called 911. But when officers arrived, Dahmer appeared calm and explained that Konorak was his adult boyfriend. He said the boy had simply drunk too much and stormed out during an argument. Despite the women pleading that the boy was clearly a child and in distress, police returned him to Dahmer's custody. Inside the apartment, officers noticed a strange smell. A large blue barrel stood in the corner. But they didn't look around. They left, and within the hour, Konorak was dead. This chilling police failure has haunted the case ever since. The officers, John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish, were later suspended but reinstated. Their decision not to investigate further gave Dahmer the confidence to continue, convinced that no one would stop him. Meanwhile, the killings continued. In total, 17 victims died at Dahmer's hands, many of them inside apartment 213. Their names include Stephen Twomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strader, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft, Konorak Synthesumphone, Stephen Hicks. Each life represented more than just a name on a list. They were sons, brothers, friends, many of them young men of color, vulnerable and targeted with intent. The majority of them were in their teens or early 20s. Many had trusted Dahmer. Some had come from broken homes or lived on the margins. Dahmer used their need for money or connection to lure them in. Inside his apartment, Dahmer documented his acts. He took Polaroid photos of his victims before and after death, graphic, disturbing evidence that later became key to the case. His freezer contained not just body parts but entire torsos, wrapped in plastic. His closet was filled with formaldehyde, scalpels, and bleach. It was a laboratory of death. The apartment itself became a prison. Some victims tried to leave but were too drugged to fight. Others were killed within minutes of arrival. For those who lingered longer, like Konorak or Tony Hughes, the horror dragged on. Dahmer took advantage of their helplessness, believing he had perfected the art of silent murder. And all this happened in the middle of a city. People lived just inches away. They heard sounds, smelled rot, saw young men go in and never come back. But they didn't know, or couldn't bring themselves to believe. Tragically, the Oxford apartments became symbolic of missed warnings. The invisible barrier between normalcy and nightmare. That one-bedroom unit, with its yellow walls and dark carpet, looked like any other from the outside. but inside it was a tomb, a museum of suffering. By the time authorities finally discovered the truth, on July 22, 1991, the damage was done. Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 people. That night, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards managed to escape Dahmer's grasp. He fled the apartment handcuffed and flagged down police. What they found when they entered apartment 213 would shock the world and redefine the meaning of horror. But in the months leading up to that night, apartment 213 remained Milwaukee's darkest secret, a place where trust failed, where cries were unheard, and where a monster thrived, hiding in plain sight. How did he get away with it for so long? What does it say about silence, bias, and the willingness to look the other way? He looked ordinary, spoke softly, even smiled when he talked. But behind that calm face was a process, methodical, cold, and unflinchingly cruel. Every step, every word, every movement was designed to control, to lure, to destroy. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't kill in a frenzy. He killed with precision. His murders were not acts of rage but rituals of dominance. From the outside, it seemed spontaneous chance encounters in bars, bus stops, or shopping centers. But the truth was far darker. Every victim was carefully chosen, and every kill followed a pattern. Dahmer's victims were mostly young men between 14 and 33 years old, many from marginalized backgrounds. He met them in gay bars, malls, or on the street. He offered them money for photos or companionship, promising quick cash and a drink back at his apartment. Once they agreed, the trap was set. Inside apartment 213, the same script unfolded again and again. He poured them a drink, often spiked with triazolam or temazepam, powerful sedatives that could knock out a grown man in minutes. His tone was friendly, almost shy. He'd turn on the television or play music, creating an illusion of comfort. Then, as soon as the drugs took hold, his demeanor changed. Silence, strangulation, then stillness. Dahmer later described these moments as peaceful. He said he didn't want his victims to suffer. He wanted them still, pliable, silent. His goal wasn't just murder, it was possession. He wanted them to stay forever, and death was the only way he knew how. After the killing, Dahmer entered what he called his ritual. It began with photography. He posed his victims' bodies in positions he found beautiful or powerful, taking Polaroids to capture every stage, before, during, and after death. These images became his trophies, proof of control that he could revisit whenever he wanted. Then came dismemberment. He used knives, saws, and sometimes even power tools. He worked on the floor, over a plastic sheet, methodically separating limbs, organs, and heads. The process was clinical, detached, but to Dahmer it was intimate, a way of keeping part of them close. The remains were disposed of in several ways. Flesh was dissolved in acid or flushed down the toilet. Bones were crushed into powder. Other pieces, skulls, hearts, genitalia, were cleaned, painted, or preserved in jars of formaldehyde. He arranged them with care, labeling nothing, yet remembering everything. When police later entered his apartment, they found an eerie order to the chaos. A refrigerator with a human head on the top shelf. A freezer containing hearts, muscles, and a full torso. In the bedroom, a filing cabinet with painted skulls. And beside his bed, an altar in progress. Dahmer had collected skulls and bones, intending to build a shrine dedicated to beauty, lit by candles and black tablecloths. He said it was meant to make him feel connected, less lonely. In his mind, it was sacred. But what made Dahmer's crimes even more disturbing was the layer of psychological obsession beneath them. He didn't kill out of hatred or impulse. He killed because he couldn't bear to be abandoned. From his teenage years, Dahmer had been obsessed with control, stemming, perhaps, from his parents' divorce and his fear of rejection. Death became his way of freezing time, keeping people from leaving. He confessed that he never wanted his victims to die screaming. He wanted them unconscious, submissive, and permanently his. When they tried to leave, panic consumed him. Murder became the solution to loneliness. I had these obsessive desires and thoughts, Dahmer told investigators, wanting to control them, to keep them with me permanently. This psychological loop repeated over and over. Lure, drug, kill, photograph, dismember, preserve. Each act fed the next. He told police that the sound of the heartbeat during strangulation made him feel powerful. The quiet after the final stillness was what he called pure possession. But the horror didn't end there. After death, Dahmer often engaged in necrophilia. He admitted to performing sexual acts with the bodies of his victims, claiming it made him feel closer to them. It was, to him, a form of communion, macabre and deeply depraved. The boundary between intimacy and brutality disappeared. Investigators and psychiatrists later dissected Dahmer's mind for years, trying to understand how someone could be so calm, so polite, and yet capable of such monstrous acts. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and necrophilic tendencies, but was found legally sane at trial. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He just didn't care. His crimes reveal a terrifying contradiction, the coexistence of empathy and evil. He told detectives he wished he could stop, that he often felt remorse after killing. But those feelings never lasted. The urge always returned, stronger each time. It was an incessant craving, he said. Once it started, I couldn't stop. Dahmer's killings evolved with each victim. Early on, he buried remains. Later, he began keeping them. By 1990, he'd stopped hiding anything. His apartment became a shrine to death. He experimented with bleach and acetone, trying to preserve skulls and skin. He even attempted to reanimate bodies, drilling holes into skulls and injecting acid, believing he could create obedient, living companions. It was madness dressed as science. What makes his method so haunting isn't just the brutality. It's the logic behind it. Dahmer's mind operated in steps, not chaos. Each murder was rehearsed, each disposal refined, each photograph catalogued. He planned everything down to the final drink. And no one around him suspected a thing. Neighbors saw a shy, quiet man who kept to himself. He worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, clocked in and out like everyone else. He rode the bus, shopped for groceries. He was invisible, and that invisibility was his camouflage. But behind the locked door of apartment 213, time froze. Each life he took added to his private collection of memories, bones, and photographs. His world narrowed to a single, twisted purpose, possession through destruction. He didn't want witnesses. He wanted permanence. The methods of Jeffrey Dahmer reveal more than murder. They expose obsession stripped of empathy. A man so consumed by loneliness that he sought to turn death into devotion. What do you think drives a person to cross that line? Loneliness, evil, or something deeper that can't be explained? If you're finding this story as chilling as we are, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who should see it, and subscribe for more real cases that uncover the darkest corners of the human mind. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. The smell hit first, then the photographs. And when police finally looked inside the blue barrel, they understood. They had just stepped into the living space of a monster. Apartment 213 was not just a home. It was a graveyard disguised as an ordinary Milwaukee apartment. It was the night of July 22, 1991, when the world of Jeffrey Dahmer finally came crashing down. That evening, Dahmer met Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, at a bar called Club 219. Dahmer offered him $100 to come back to his apartment to pose for photographs. Edwards agreed, unaware that he was walking into the most horrifying crime scene in American history. Inside apartment 213, Dahmer's demeanor shifted quickly. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of chemicals and rot. The fish tank sat empty, covered in grime. On the table were Polaroid photos, beer cans, and a power drill. Tracy Edwards noticed a foul odor and a strange blue barrel in the corner. Dahmer tried to handcuff him, and when that failed, he forced one cuff around Edwards's wrist. But Edwards stayed calm. He spoke gently, tried to reason with him. He knew one wrong move could mean death. Dahmer turned on a horror movie, The Exorcist 3, and began to rock back and forth, chanting softly. Edwards waited for his chance. When Dahmer's attention slipped, he punched him and bolted for the door. Barefoot and terrified, he ran into the street, waving down 2 Milwaukee police officers. It should have been just another disturbance call. But when officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Roth followed Edwards back to apartment 213, what they found defied comprehension. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with decay and chemicals. The officers immediately noticed the smell. A sour, metallic stench that clung to their clothes. The carpet was stained. The refrigerator hummed quietly. And next to it, a stack of Polaroids lay on a dresser. Officer Mueller flipped one over. Then another. And another. Each photo showed what appeared to be a human body. Posed, dismembered, and photographed in vivid detail. The men in the pictures were missing heads, limbs, or skin. Some images showed body parts stacked in the very same bedroom where they now stood. Mueller froze. He turned to his partner and said, quietly, "These are real." At that moment, Dahmer lunged for the photos, trying to stop them. The officers subdued him, pinned him to the floor, and called for backup. The truth was finally out, but no one was prepared for the scale of what lay inside. As investigators began their search, they realized apartment 213 was not an apartment at all. It was a chamber of horrors. In the kitchen freezer, they found a human head, carefully wrapped in plastic, and 3 human hearts. In the refrigerator, next to open condiments, sat more flesh. In the bedroom closet, they found skulls, some bleached, some painted gray, others still bearing tissue. A large blue barrel, sealed tight, contained a mixture of acid and decomposing torsos. The barrel had been heating under the apartment's air vent to accelerate decomposition. When technicians opened it, the smell nearly made them faint. On a shelf nearby, detectives found 2 human skeletons, 7 skulls, and jars containing preserved genitalia. A filing cabinet held dozens of Polaroid photographs, the same ones that had exposed his crimes. In the fish tank, instead of fish, they found bones. And on the bed, black satin sheets stained dark from fluids. The inventory of evidence was staggering. 74 Polaroid photos documenting every stage of murder and dismemberment. A freezer containing human organs. Boxes of mummified skulls. A large 57-gallon chemical drum filled with 3 torsos. Tools including saws, knives, bleach, and formaldehyde. Jars of human remains. Drawings of an altered Dahmer plan to build, complete with candles and black curtains, meant to display the skulls of his victims. Investigators described the apartment as both clinical and chaotic, a place where science met insanity. The walls were dotted with holes where Dahmer had drilled into skulls. On one wall, he had nailed photographs of men, smiling, unaware that they would soon become part of his gruesome collection. When forensic technicians arrived, they wore gas masks. The smell was unbearable. The acid barrel had corroded metal and soaked through the floorboards. It took more than 2 days to process the entire apartment. Every drawer, every cabinet, every inch held traces of death. One detective later said, "You couldn't take a step without finding a bone." The photographs, perhaps more than anything, told the real story. Each Polaroid was time-stamped, methodical, staged. They captured Dahmer's obsession with transformation, his attempt to preserve beauty by freezing it in time. Some photos showed victims before death, smiling. Others, after death, positioned in ways that suggested reverence, not rage. It was as though Dahmer saw them as art rather than people. When questioned, Dahmer confessed with unsettling calm. He recited his crimes in order, detailing how he dissolved flesh, bleached bones, and kept souvenirs to feel close to his victims. He showed no panic, no denial, just a quiet explanation, as if describing a routine. The detectives listening were horrified by his composure. He spoke of dismemberment and cannibalism the way someone might talk about grocery shopping. The apartment's discovery sent shockwaves across the world. Reporters swarmed Milwaukee. Neighbors cried in disbelief. Families of missing men finally learned the fate of their sons, though some bodies were too damaged to identify. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to match bones and fragments to the 17 known victims. DNA testing confirmed what many feared. The photos and remains matched the missing. The Oxford apartments were soon evacuated. Residents were too traumatized to stay. By 1992, the building was demolished, the ground left vacant as a symbolic grave for the unnamed and the lost. The site remains empty today, a reminder of the silence that once covered unimaginable evil. Even years later, officers who entered apartment 213 struggled to speak of it. Some developed PTSD. Others left law enforcement entirely. One detective described opening the refrigerator and seeing a human head staring back at him. He said, "That image never leaves you. It never will." The discovery of the photos and the acid drum changed criminal history. It forced law enforcement to re-examine how such crimes could go unnoticed for so long, how charm, race, and quiet neighborhoods could shield a predator in plain sight. What do you think haunted investigators more? The smell, the photos, or the realization that this horror had been happening under their noses all along? He had been caught before, warned before, reported before, but each time Jeffrey Dahmer slipped through the cracks, protected not by brilliance, but by neglect, bias, and a system that refused to see what was right in front of it. When police finally arrested Jeffrey Dahmer on July 22, 1991, one question echoed louder than all others. How did this go on for so long? 17 men and boys dead. Years of neighbors complaining about smells, noises, and missing people. And yet, Dahmer lived openly in Milwaukee, working, drinking, and killing in the same apartment. The answer isn't simple. It's a tangle of missed opportunities, societal blind spots, and a deadly combination of disbelief and indifference. Dahmer's encounters with law enforcement began long before his final arrest. In 1988, 3 years before his capture, Dahmer was convicted of second-degree sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy, Conorak Synthesumphone. He was sentenced to 5 years but served only 10 months in jail, followed by probation. During that time, the court labeled him as someone needing treatment but not confinement. The system viewed Dahmer as troubled, not dangerous. His mild demeanor fooled judges, psychologists, and even parole officers. He told them he wanted to get his life together, that he had learned his lesson. They believed him, but the truth was that Dahmer was already planning his next crime. After his release in 1990, Dahmer moved into the Oxford apartments, less than a mile from where he'd assaulted that boy. And tragically, it was Conorak's younger brother, just 14 years old, who would later become one of his final victims. The night of May 27, 1991, remains one of the most infamous failures in American policing. That night, 3 women, Sandra Smith, Nicole Childress, and Glenda Cleveland, spotted a young, naked, and bleeding boy stumbling through the streets near Dahmer's apartment. The boy was dazed, speaking softly, unable to stand. They called 911. Officers John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish responded. The women tried to explain that the boy looked too young and terrified to be safe. But when Dahmer approached the scene, calm and smiling, he told them it was all a misunderstanding. He said the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had drunk too much. The officers laughed. They accepted Dahmer's story without checking identification or verifying the boy's age. Conorak was only 14. The women begged the officers not to leave him there. They pointed out that the boy was clearly a child, that something was wrong. But Dahmer's quiet confidence and the fact that both men were gay, in an era when police were notoriously uncomfortable with same-sex relationships, made the officers eager to walk away. They helped Dahmer bring the child back into his apartment, even ignoring the stench of death inside. Moments later, Dahmer murdered Conorak and photographed his body. The officers reported back to dispatch with chilling casualness, saying they had reunited the lovers. One even joked about cleaning up after homosexuals. The report was closed as a domestic dispute, no further investigation. That single act of negligence allowed Dahmer to kill 4 more men before his eventual arrest 8 weeks later. But the Conorak incident wasn't the only missed opportunity. Neighbors had complained for months about the smell and strange noises. One tenant, Pamela Bass, said she called the building manager multiple times. Dahmer always had an excuse: spoiled meat, tropical fish, or chemical cleaning supplies. His politeness made his stories believable. No one pressed further. Another neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, who lived next door, though not in the same building, was perhaps the most persistent. After the Conorak incident, She called police multiple times, asking them to recheck Dahmer's apartment. She even contacted the FBI. Each time, her warnings were dismissed. Cleveland told reporters later, "I knew something was wrong, but nobody listened to a black woman in that neighborhood." Her words summed up what many came to believe, that race and class shaped the indifference that allowed Dahmer to continue killing. Most of Dahmer's victims were men of color, black, Asian, or Latino, many from marginalized backgrounds or struggling economically. In early 90s Milwaukee, their disappearances rarely drew serious investigation. Families filed missing person reports that went nowhere. Police departments at the time were understaffed and undertrained in handling crimes involving gay victims, particularly in poor or minority neighborhoods. The result was deadly. There were other points of failure, too. In 1988, while Dahmer was still on probation, he was found with a Polaroid of a naked boy. Instead of searching his home, officers gave him a warning. At one point, a probation officer visited his apartment and noted the smell, but accepted Dahmer's explanation that he'd had meat go bad in his freezer. No inspection followed. Even the court system seemed eager to move on. Despite a pattern of sexual offenses, Dahmer was labeled low risk and recommended for early release. His father, Lionel Dahmer, begged judges to order psychological treatment for his son, but the request was denied. When Dahmer's crimes were finally uncovered, the city of Milwaukee faced outrage. Public protests erupted. The two officers who had returned Conarac to Dahmer were fired, but later reinstated after a police union appeal. They went back to work with full back pay, a decision that still haunts the department's history. The case became a symbol of how prejudice and complacency can blind justice. Dahmer didn't just hide behind his apartment door. He hid behind assumptions. He was white, quiet, employed, and polite to the system that made him safe. His victims, young men of color, gay, often poor, were not. The tragedy of Conarac Synthesumphone exposes what happens when bias meets bureaucracy. The women who called for help saw the truth, but their warnings were ignored. And for weeks after, Glenda Cleveland kept calling, hoping someone would finally listen. No one did, until Tracy Edwards ran out of that same apartment, handcuffed and terrified, and forced the world to see what had been ignored for years. Today, the Conarac case is still studied in police academies as one of the most devastating examples of systemic failure. It asks hard questions about how we define credibility, who we choose to protect, and whose voices are believed. What do you think would have happened if just one officer, had looked past Dahmer's calm smile that night? If stories like this make you think twice about how systems fail the most vulnerable, don't scroll past. Like this video, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe for more real crime stories that demand answers. Tap the bell. Justice begins with awareness. He didn't deny a thing. No protest. No excuses. Just a quiet voice describing dismemberment, cannibalism, and ritual. The man behind the horror had been caught. But now the world had to listen to what he'd done. After the arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer in July 1991, the headlines spread like wildfire. News anchors struggled to describe the contents of apartment 213. The phrase House of Horrors became a permanent fixture in American vocabulary. But as the shock gave way to questions, the nation turned its attention to the courtroom. The trial of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. By then, he had already confessed in full to the murders of 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Every name, every method, every detail. His statements to police were so thorough that prosecutors said he left nothing to the imagination. But even with full confessions, a legal battle remained. Dahmer faced 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin. 2 more charges followed later in Ohio. The central question of the trial wasn't guilt, it was sanity. His legal team entered a plea of guilty but insane. They argued that Dahmer's crimes were so depraved that no mentally sound person could have committed them. The prosecution countered that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, and that he killed not out of delusion, but desire. This wasn't just a trial, it was a national spectacle. Every moment was broadcast live. Viewers around the world watched as survivors, victims' families, psychologists, and detectives took the stand. The courtroom, with its beige walls and wooden benches, became a theater of grief and horror. Dahmer sat silently through most of the proceedings. Dressed in a light-colored shirt and glasses, he rarely made eye contact with the public or the media. He showed no outbursts, no emotion, just a cold, quiet calm that unsettled everyone in the room. For the families of the victims, seeing him so composed, so ordinary, was enraging. One mother later said, "He looked like a man who had just come in from work, not someone who murdered my son." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with both sides calling experts to weigh in on Dahmer's mental state. Psychiatrists hired by the defense diagnosed him with several conditions: necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. They claimed these disorders distorted his grasp of morality, but prosecution experts argued the opposite. Dahmer had gone to great lengths to hide his crimes, using locks, acid, and explanations for the smell. He paid rent on time. He cleaned his apartment before expected visits. He targeted vulnerable individuals and avoided detection for over a decade. These weren't the actions of a man disconnected from reality. They were methodical, calculated, and intentional. Assistant District Attorney E. Michael McCann told the court, "He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He said he didn't want to do it. But he did it anyway, again and again." Perhaps the most painful moments came from the victim impact statements. One by one, family members stepped up to speak. They told stories of birthdays missed, empty chairs at dinner tables, and memories of sons and brothers who vanished without a trace. Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, delivered one of the most emotional statements ever recorded in a courtroom. Standing just feet from Dahmer, her voice shook with rage and heartbreak as she shouted, "This is how you act when you're out of control?" She had to be restrained by deputies, screaming that she didn't want to lose control, but the pain was too much. The courtroom was stunned. Even Dahmer appeared shaken for a moment, his head down, lips tight. It was one of the few times anyone saw him react. On February 15, 1992, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all 15 counts of murder. They rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and criminally responsible. The judge, Lawrence Graham, sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. He would later receive another life sentence in Ohio for the 1978 murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters noted that Dahmer looked unchanged, expressionless. No tears, no resistance. He simply walked away. But outside that courtroom, the city of Milwaukee was unraveling. Protests erupted. Black and LGBTQ communities demanded accountability for how police had ignored missing person reports. Many saw the trial as justice served, but others saw it as too little, too late. Community leaders asked why police had believed Dahmer over a group of black women who tried to save a 14-year-old boy. Why a convicted sex offender was allowed to live alone with no surprise checks. Why reports of screams and foul smells were written off as domestic issues. The trial may have ended with convictions, but it opened wounds that would take years to close. In later interviews, Dahmer spoke freely about his crimes. He told reporters he felt remorse, that he believed he deserved death. He admitted to fantasizing about murder since age 14, and that his desire for complete control had consumed him. One psychiatrist said, "It's not that Dahmer had no conscience. It's that his need to act was stronger than his conscience could handle. He wasn't a man fighting voices in his head. He was a man giving in to his darkest fantasies, with full awareness." Dahmer told one interviewer, "I should have been stopped earlier. There were several chances, but nobody did. I take full responsibility. I killed them. I did everything they said I did." The court had done its job. The sentences were passed. But justice, for many, still felt far away. What do you think matters more in a case like this, the sentence or the system that allowed it all to happen in the first place? He spoke with no rage, no confusion, just calm, unsettling clarity. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't plead innocence. He didn't hide. He confessed in full. But when the world looked closer, one question remained. Was he evil or deeply unwell? After his arrest in July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer sat with detectives for hours. No lawyer, no struggle, no hesitation. He gave a full, detailed confession, names, methods, timelines. And as each word spilled from his mouth, investigators realized they weren't just building a criminal case. They were stepping into the mind of a killer. Dahmer's demeanor surprised everyone. He was quiet, respectful. He answered questions without prompting, sometimes even volunteering more detail than asked. He admitted to everything: the sedatives, the killings, the dismemberment, the preservation, the cannibalism. His language was clinical, not emotional. At times, it seemed like he was describing someone else's actions, until he'd add, "I enjoyed it." For investigators and prosecutors, the horror wasn't just what Dahmer had done. It was how calmly he owned it. There were no signs of remorse, not at first. Just reflection, cold and matter-of-fact. He said he felt relief that it was over, that he'd been caught, that he wouldn't have to kill again. But that wasn't enough for the legal system. Before the trial could move forward, the courts ordered a full psychological evaluation. The defense had entered a plea of guilty but insane. So now the task was to determine whether Dahmer understood the difference between right and wrong, or if he was mentally ill to the point of being not criminally responsible. And so began one of the most controversial and intense psychiatric reviews in modern criminal history. Dahmer was examined by multiple psychiatrists and psychologists, both for the defense and the prosecution. Over weeks, he underwent interviews, tests, and evaluations. Experts dug into his childhood, his fantasies, his habits, his guilt, and his compulsions. What emerged was a deeply conflicted picture. On one side, the defense presented Dahmer as a profoundly disturbed man. They diagnosed him with necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, borderline personality disorder, unstable relationships, identity and behavior, schizotypal personality disorder, distorted thinking and unusual beliefs, alcohol dependence, chronic substance use that impaired his judgment. They argued that these conditions created a storm inside Dahmer, one that robbed him of the ability to control himself, that he didn't kill out of malice or cruelty, but compulsion, that his brain was wired for obsession, and his crimes were his way of coping with a world he couldn't connect with. Defense experts said Dahmer killed not to hurt, but to keep, to hold on to people who he feared would otherwise leave him, that he viewed his victims not as targets, but as companions in death. They painted him not as a monster, but as a broken man seeking permanence in the most disturbing way imaginable. But the prosecution told a different story. Their experts, just as credentialed, just as experienced, insisted Dahmer was legally sane. Yes, he had disturbing fantasies. Yes, he had unusual desires. But he also took steps to avoid detection, lied to neighbors, family, and police, used sedatives and locked doors to maintain control, carefully photographed, labeled, and preserved body parts, made conscious decisions to kill again and again, knowing it was wrong. They argued that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, and that his careful efforts to hide the crimes proved intent and awareness. One psychologist testified that Dahmer had a deep need for control, but that he was fully responsible for the choices he made to satisfy it. At the heart of both sides was a single chilling question. Was Jeffrey Dahmer a man so mentally ill that he couldn't stop himself? Or was he a man who simply didn't care to? Throughout it all, Dahmer cooperated. He admitted to sexual fantasies involving dominance, power, and death as early as his teens. He spoke of his first murder, Stephen Hicks, as impulsive, but admitted that later killings were planned. He explained that he had wanted complete control, a companion who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't talk back, who would simply be. That's why he experimented with acid lobotomies, drilling into skulls and injecting chemicals to create zombies. He thought if he could keep someone alive but compliant, he wouldn't have to kill them. But it never worked. He confessed to eating parts of his victims, not out of hunger but to feel closer to them. He said he kept skulls and bones around to feel less alone. that holding on to those remains gave him comfort, possession, peace. And when asked how he felt about the murders now, Dahmer didn't beg for mercy. He said he deserved to die, that he felt remorse but also relief, that if he hadn't been caught, he would have kept going, because stopping on his own felt impossible. In court, these revelations were difficult to process. How could someone so aware of his actions also claim to be so out of control? Was he being honest or manipulating the system? Even the experts couldn't agree. One psychiatrist later said, "He's the rare case where we don't ask why did he do it, but rather, how did it take so long to stop him?" Another remarked, "He's not legally insane, but he's not well either. He sits in a gray zone most people can't understand." And that's what made Dahmer so terrifying. He wasn't frothing at the mouth. He wasn't incoherent or ranting. He was a man who knew how to function in the world, and still chose to turn death into routine. Jeffrey Dahmer's mind remains one of the most analyzed in criminal history. Documentaries, books, and university lectures still dissect his interviews, searching for a reason, a switch, a flaw. But maybe there isn't one. Maybe, as one FBI profiler said, some people aren't born evil, but they fall into darkness so deep, there's no coming back. Dahmer never denied his guilt. He never blamed anyone else. But even after hundreds of pages of psych reports, the question lingers. Was he born this way, or did the world help make him? What do you think separates mental illness from pure cruelty, and can both exist in the same man? He survived court, confessed to everything, received nearly 1,000 years in prison. But less than 3 years later, Jeffrey Dahmer was dead, killed in a locked facility by a fellow inmate. The question wasn't just how it happened, but whether it was justice. After his sentencing in February 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, a maximum security prison. He had been convicted of killing 17 people. He admitted to every one of them. Now, he would serve 15 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. But prison didn't offer the anonymity Dahmer seemed to crave. He was one of the most infamous killers in American history. Inside those walls, he was a marked man. At first, he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. The prison warden feared he would be attacked or worse by other inmates. For the first year, Dahmer lived in near isolation, spending 23 hours a day in his cell. Guards monitored him closely. His meals were delivered. He wasn't allowed to mingle with the general population. And yet, despite the confinement, Dahmer began to change. He started reading the Bible. He requested books on faith. He began meeting with Roy Ratcliffe, a Church of Christ minister. After several months of study and discussion, Dahmer was baptized in May 1994, in the prison's whirlpool tub, witnessed by guards and the chaplain. To some, it seemed like a cynical move, a serial killer seeking redemption after facing the consequences of his crimes. But others saw sincerity. Ratcliffe later said, "He never asked for release. He never tried to blame others. He said he knew he deserved to be here, and that only God could forgive him." Dahmer's religious turn wasn't the only change. He began giving interviews from prison. One of the most notable was his 1994 sit-down with Stone Phillips of Dateline NBC. In it, Dahmer came across as calm, articulate, and unervingly honest. He spoke openly about his crimes, his past, and his need for control. He admitted to having no interest in denying responsibility. If a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges, he said. That quote stuck with people. Some took it as genuine reflection, others as manipulation, a sociopath adapting to his surroundings, as he always had. By late 1994, prison officials moved Dahmer out of isolation and into the general population, a controversial decision. The argument was that inmates couldn't be held in solitary forever. But the risk was clear. Dahmer was a target not only for what he'd done, but for who he had done it to. Many of his victims were Black and Latino, and Dahmer himself had become the center of media attention, seen by some as being treated gently by the system. Other inmates viewed him with disgust and rage. It didn't help that Dahmer reportedly mocked guards and inmates by shaping food into body parts and pretending to pour ketchup on them like blood. Some reports claimed he was obsessed with his own notoriety, that he enjoyed the dark curiosity people had about him, that he wanted to be remembered, not as a monster, but as someone important. It was a dangerous mix. And then came November 28, 1994. That morning, Dahmer, along with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, was assigned to a work detail. They were to clean the prison gymnasium bathrooms. No guards were present in the room, just the three of them. The task was supposed to take less than an hour. But within minutes, Dahmer and Anderson were both found brutally beaten. The weapon was a 20-inch metal bar, taken from exercise equipment. Christopher Scarver, a 25-year-old serving a life sentence for murder, later told authorities that he had waited for his moment, that he had received signs from God to punish those who had taken innocent lives. Scarver attacked Dahmer first, striking him repeatedly in the head and face. Then he turned on Anderson, who had been convicted of killing his wife and blaming two black men for the crime. By the time guards returned, it was over. Dahmer was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life, but his injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m. He was 34 years old. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some said justice had finally been served, that prison had finished what the courts could not. Others called it a failure of the state, that even the most reviled inmates deserve protection behind bars. Families of victims were divided too. Some expressed relief. One man said, "Good riddance. He got what he gave." Others had hoped Dahmer would live a long, miserable life in prison, reflecting on his crimes every day. His parents, Lionel and Sherry Dahmer, were devastated. They had continued to visit Jeffrey regularly, believing his conversion was genuine. His mother, Joyce, told the press that she wished he had died years earlier, when he was a teenager, and spared the world his crimes. The media speculated endlessly. Did the prison ignore the threat? Did Dahmer provoke Scarver? Was it premeditated murder or something deeper, revenge on behalf of the voiceless? Scarver later gave conflicting statements. In one interview, he claimed Dahmer mocked other inmates and had to be stopped. In another, he said he acted alone without planning. Regardless, Scarver was never charged with capital punishment. He received 2 more life sentences and remains incarcerated today. After Dahmer's death, the state offered his remains to his family. His body was cremated, but his brain, the subject of endless scientific curiosity, became a source of contention. Joyce Dahmer wanted it preserved and studied, hoping for clues to what made her son a killer. Lionel insisted it be destroyed. In the end, a judge ruled that the brain should be cremated, too. There would be no museum exhibit, no medical study, no lingering trace of what was inside the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer. The space where he died, the gym in Columbia Correctional, was quietly closed off. The state made no ceremony. There was no memorial, just silence. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer died the way many believed he should have, violently and without warning. But his death raised uncomfortable questions. Was it justice, or just another act of brutality inside a system that had already failed too many? What do you believe? Was Dahmer's death the final chapter in his horror story, or just one more page in a book filled with unanswered pain? He's been dead for decades, yet his name still trends, still headlines, still haunts. We remember the crimes, the photos, the apartment, but do we remember the people he took? Why does Jeffrey Dahmer remain a symbol of horror, when others, just as deadly, fade from view? After his violent death in prison in 1994, many expected Jeffrey Dahmer's story to end. His apartment was demolished, his remains cremated, his belongings destroyed. Even his brain, once considered for scientific study, was incinerated by court order. And yet, he never truly disappeared. Instead, Dahmer became something else. Not just a criminal, but a fixture of American culture. A reference, cautionary tale, a headline that never goes away. Over the years, his story has been retold again and again, in documentaries, podcasts, books, crime shows, and dramatized series. Each retelling reignites the same fascination. How could someone so ordinary commit acts so unspeakable? In 2002, the film Dahmer, starring Jeremy Renner, gave viewers a dramatized glimpse into his life. In 2012, My Friend Dahmer, based on the graphic memoir by a high school classmate, explored his early years before the killing began. And in 2022, Netflix released Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, a 10-part dramatized series starring Evan Peters. It topped streaming charts worldwide, sparking both record-breaking views and global backlash. Critics argued that the series sensationalized the trauma of real families. Some of the victims' relatives said they were never contacted or consulted. Shirley Hughes, mother of Tony Hughes, a deaf victim, said reliving her son's death on screen without warning was devastating. She told reporters, "It didn't happen like that. I don't need to see it again." Others defended the show as educational, an unflinching look at how race, homophobia, and police neglect allowed a killer to go unchecked. But the debate raised a deeper question. When does storytelling cross the line into exploitation? Dahmer's name has become shorthand for evil. His mugshot printed on merchandise, his face used in memes, his crimes summarized in seconds on TikTok. But behind every headline are 17 lives. Men and boys with families, with futures, erased by one man's obsession. Their names are often forgotten, but they deserve to be remembered. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthesumphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft. Each had a story. Each had dreams, communities, and people who loved them. Most were young men of color. Many were gay. Some were just teenagers. And yet, in many tellings of Dahmer's life, they are reduced to timelines and numbers. True crime audiences have grown in recent years. Podcasts dissect old cases. YouTube channels build entire followings around unsolved murders. Streaming platforms compete for the next shocking docuseries. But with this growth comes responsibility. Dahmer's legacy forces us to ask, are we consuming pain for entertainment? Are we remembering victims? Or just reliving the horror? Some memorial efforts have tried to shift the focus. In 1991, the Milwaukee Gay Arts Center launched a project to honor Dahmer's victims through poetry, portraits, and remembrance. In later years, activists called for a permanent memorial at the former site of the Oxford Apartments. That lot remains vacant to this day, quiet, unmarked, and still carrying the weight of what happened there. Glenda Cleveland, the neighbor who tried to save Conorak, is finally receiving long overdue recognition. In 2023, the city of Milwaukee renamed a portion of 27th Street in her honor. But it took decades for her voice to be valued, even though she spoke up first. Dahmer's story endures not just because of its brutality, but because it exposes everything that failed. A legal system that released him after child molestation. A police force that returned a 14-year-old to his killer. A culture that ignored missing men from marginalized communities. And a society that still struggles to protect the most vulnerable. The fascination with Dahmer is partly psychological. We ask, what makes someone like that? Was it nature, nurture, or something beyond explanation? But the deeper fear is this: how many more like him could be hiding in plain sight? In the end, Dahmer's true legacy isn't just about what he did. It's about how many people failed to stop him, and how, decades later, his victims still fight to be remembered not as footnotes in his horror story, but as the reason we should never look away again. So the next time his name trends, or a new series drops, or someone laughs at a meme, ask yourself, are we keeping the story alive? Or the killer? And more importantly, whose names are we forgetting in the process, in memory of the lives lost? Before we close the story, let us remember that behind every headline and photograph were real people. Sons, brothers, friends, who deserve to be known for more than the violence that took them. Their names should never be forgotten. Stephen Hicks, 18. Stephen Twomey, 25. James Dockstader, 14. Richard Guerrero, 22. Anthony Sears, 24. Raymond Smith, 32. Edward Smith, 28. Ernest Miller, 22. David Thomas, 22. Curtis Strader, 17. Errol Lindsay, 19. Tony Hughes, 31. Conorak Synthesumphone, 14. Matt Turner, 20. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23. Oliver Lacey, 24. Joseph Braidhoft, 25. They were more than victims. They were musicians, students, sons of immigrants, fathers-to-be, dreamers. Their lives were stolen, but their stories deserve the dignity that was denied them in death. To their families, to their communities, and to everyone who tried to be heard but wasn't, this story is told in their memory. May they never be reduced to just the name of the man who took them. May their names outlive his. If you believe their names deserve to be heard louder than his, share this video, subscribe, and comment so their stories are never buried again. And tap the notification bell, because remembering them is where true justice begins.